At my son's wedding, he didn't invite me to sit with the family. He led my wife and me around the back, through the kitchen, then opened a dark door. He lowered his voice and said, "Mom and Dad, just sit here for now, so you won't draw attention." I stood there, in a suit I had worn for 10 years, listening to the music drifting in from the main hall. When I reached for my wife's hand, ready to leave, a stranger gently touched my shoulder and whispered, "Just pretend you're sitting with me." If you're listening to this story, and you believe parents should never be treated like an afterthought, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss real stories like this. And leave a comment telling me where you're listening from, because right after this, I'll tell you what happened behind that dark door. I followed Brandon across the parking lot, where the sea breeze carried a faint smell of salt. This wasn't the main entrance. The main entrance was out front. Bright carpet, tall glass doors, men in tailored suits laughing and talking. My son didn't look that way. He walked faster, like he was afraid someone might notice we were together. He stopped beside a luxury car, parked close to the wall, and turned to me. His voice was low and clipped, the way he sounds when talking business. "Please understand, Dad. Most of my guests are people from my circle. You and Mom going through the main hall. It wouldn't be appropriate." I looked at my son's face. 30 years ago, that same face used to look up at me when I carried him into my carpentry shop, his little hand gripping my finger, scared of the sound of the saw. Today, his eyes avoided mine, as if I were something unnecessary. Melissa stood beside me. She didn't say a word. I knew her leg had been hurting for weeks. That morning, she had still walked slowly, just so I wouldn't worry. Brandon glanced down at his mother's worn shoes, and quickly seized on that excuse. "Mom's leg is hurting anyway. I've got a quieter place. You can sit there and watch the ceremony comfortably." He led us around to the back of the hotel. With every step, the light grew dimmer. The wedding music faded into a distant echo. At the end of the hallway, Brandon opened a metal door. Inside was a narrow room, low ceiling, cold, white lights. A few uniforms hung on hooks, a long bench against the wall, a small TV mounted high up, live streaming the ceremony from the main hall. "Just sit here for now. Staff still use this room. No one will bother you." He spoke quickly, like he didn't want to stay. I looked around. The smell of laundry and mild detergent. No windows, no flowers, no laughter. Just the image of my son on a screen, standing under bright lights, wearing a brand new suit. I knew he bought it with the first money he made from his company. Melissa sat down. She placed her hands on her knees and let out a quiet breath. I stood there for a moment, not because I was tired, but because I needed a few seconds to understand what was happening. I had thought, no matter what, today was his day. I didn't need a front row seat. I just never imagined I would be placed in a room where even the light wasn't meant for us. Through the slightly open door, I saw staff members walk past. They glanced in, then looked away, assuming we were hotel workers. I didn't correct them. Maybe, in my son's eyes, that was all we were. The ceremony began. On the screen, Brandon smiled brightly. He hugged Sloane's parents, calling them by affectionate names I had never heard him use with me. Melissa watched the screen, her eyes shimmering, but no tears fell. I knew she was wondering what she had done wrong. I thought about the suit I was wearing. I bought it 10 years ago, when Brandon said he needed money for a house down payment. I told myself an old suit was fine. I didn't need anything new. I just wanted my son to have a steadier life than I ever did. I never imagined that suit would become the reason I was hidden away. A little later, Sloane stepped into the room. She only needed more tissues. Her eyes swept over us, then stopped on Melissa, who had her head lowered. Melissa gently wiped her eyes. Sloane sighed, adjusted her dress, and said, not loudly, but clearly enough, "Please don't cry in here. I still have to be on camera later. People will see." Then she turned and left. The door closed. The room fell quiet again, except for the voices from the screen and my wife's steady breathing. I placed my hand on her shoulder. She took my hand, softly but firmly. "I'm fine," she whispered. I knew she wasn't. I looked around one last time. This room wasn't for guests. It was for people who weren't meant to be seen. I understood that message very clearly. I bent down and told Melissa we should go home. No need to make a scene. No need to make anyone more uncomfortable. Just as I opened the door, a hotel manager stepped in front of us. He looked me up and down, suspicion in his eyes. "Where do you think you're going? This area isn't for guests." Before I could answer, he motioned to security. In that moment, a bitter truth settled in. In this place, I wasn't the groom's father. I was just someone who didn't belong at the party. I was about to take Melissa's hand and walk past them, leaving the hotel in silence. And right then, when I had already accepted retreat, a calm, steady voice sounded behind me. "Wait a moment. Where do you think you're going?" I turned back on instinct. I hadn't even seen who spoke yet, but the manager froze. His tone changed instantly. He dipped his head, stepped aside, like he'd just realized he was standing in the wrong place. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew that feeling. The feeling when authority enters a room without raising its voice. The man standing there wore simple, light-colored clothes, nothing flashy. Yet the way he stood made the space feel slower, quieter. His eyes moved over me, over Melissa, then paused on the room behind us. He didn't ask questions. He just looked, and for the first time that evening, I felt seen. "It's not comfortable in there," he said, calm and even. "This party is crowded. You shouldn't be in that place." The manager bowed deeper. I didn't know how to respond. I was used to staying quiet when pushed aside. I wasn't used to someone pulling me back. "We took the wrong way," I said, out of habit. "We're leaving." The man looked straight at me. No pity, no curiosity, just a steady look, like he was weighing a very simple decision. "No," he said. "You haven't eaten yet." He turned to the manager and spoke a few short sentences. I couldn't hear them clearly, but I saw the change immediately. The manager nodded again and again, then waved the security away. The doors to the main hall opened in front of me, wide, bright enough that I had to squint. Music poured out, the clink of glasses, the scent of fresh flowers. I had been standing at the edge of this party all evening, and now I was being pulled straight into its center. We stepped inside. Melissa tightened her grip on my hand. I could feel her hesitation, the fear of stepping into a place that wasn't meant for her. I felt it too. But I didn't stop. I had stopped enough in my life. Guests turned to look. A few curious glances. A few uneasy ones. I saw Brandon across the room, smiling, wine glass in hand, standing beside Sloane. That smile vanished the moment he saw us. For a brief second I saw panic on my son's face. Not worry for us, but fear that the image he had built was starting to crack. The man led us to a large table near the center. A small sign stood on it, marked with investor names. I didn't understand every word, but I understood the position of that table. This wasn't a place you sat by mistake. "Sit," he said. "Here." Melissa hesitated. I pulled out her chair. When she sat down, I saw her shoulders loosen, like she'd finally been allowed to breathe. I sat across from her, back straight, hands resting on the table. I didn't try to belong here. I just sat the way I always sit. Anywhere. Sloane reacted first. She leaned in and whispered something to Brandon. He turned, looked at us, then at the man standing beside the table. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He took a step forward, then stopped. Like an invisible thread was holding him in place. The party continued, but its rhythm had changed. I caught fragments of whispers. I noticed people staring a little longer than necessary. I saw Sloane's parents looking over, their eyes measuring us. They didn't greet us. They didn't look away either. They were evaluating. The man sat down beside me. He looked toward the stage where the host was talking about the couple's love story, about a solid foundation, about a bright future. "That table," he said softly, without looking at me, "is walnut, hand-joined. No metal screws in the main joints." I turned to him. My heartbeat slowed. "You recognized it?" I asked. He nodded. "There are marks only the maker leaves behind." I looked down at my hands. Old calluses. Cracks time never erased. I had never thought anyone in this room would notice a table. On stage, Brandon was invited to speak. He took the microphone, drew a deep breath. I watched him, not as a guest, but as a father watching the man his son had chosen to become. He spoke about ambition, about entering a new world, about leaving behind things that were no longer suitable. He didn't look in our direction, but every word felt like a door quietly closing. I didn't interrupt. I didn't stand up. I just sat there, listened, and let the silence inside me grow. When the applause rose, the man beside me set his glass down. He turned to me, his expression calm, unchanged. Maybe he said, "It's time everyone in this room knows who built the table they're leaning on." I didn't answer right away. I looked toward the stage, where my son was bowing in thanks amid the applause. I knew this fragile calm was about to end. And this time, I wasn't the one being led out. The man beside me didn't say anything more. He simply stood up, straightened his chair, then leaned slightly toward me, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "There are evenings," he said, "when people need to sit in the right place, so things can return to where they truly belong." I didn't ask who he was. I've learned not to ask questions that don't need answers. I followed the direction of his hand. The center table. The one Brandon and Sloane had tried all evening to get close to, and had been politely turned away from every time. A table for people who don't need introductions. "Would you mind," he continued, "if tonight you just pretend you're sitting with me?" The words sounded casual, almost polite. But I knew this wasn't an ordinary invitation. I looked at Melissa. She looked back at me. Worry in her eyes, yes, but also something else. The exhaustion of someone who has endured enough. "If you're okay with it," she said softly. I nodded, not out of curiosity, not to prove anything. I just didn't want to leave again. We stood up. The man walked half a step ahead, never rushing us. As we crossed the open space between tables, I felt the silence spread. The music kept playing, but conversations faded. I heard chairs shift, whispers cut short. No one said it out loud, but everyone sensed something was drifting off script. The center table felt brighter, not because of the lights, but because the space around it was always kept clear. The man pulled out a chair for Melissa, then motioned for me to sit across from her. He sat down last, placed his hands on the table. Calm, as if this had always been the natural order. A server appeared instantly. Head bowed. No names asked. No confirmation needed. Water poured in silence. That's when I noticed the difference. No one here asked who we were. Brandon stood not far away. I saw him turn to Sloane, speaking quickly. She shook her head, lips pressed tight. Her parents glanced over, then turned away, as if they wanted no part of it. I didn't feel angry. I only felt the distance my son had built with his own hands. The man beside me glanced at my wrist. There was a small metal pin there, a wood chisel. I'd worn it since retirement. An old habit. Something I never thought anyone would notice. "You kept it," he said. I was surprised. "Kept what?" "The pin," he replied. "I've seen that mark on a few pieces. Not many, but enough to recognize it." I looked at him more carefully. An unfamiliar face, a voice without flair, eyes that never searched for attention. In that moment I understood why he could sit here, without anyone needing to know his name. "I was just doing my job," I said. "Back then." He nodded. "Some people do their work. Others live off that work." I didn't ask more, but I could feel something being placed on the table, slowly, deliberately. The party moved into its main segment. The host announced a speech from the hotel's lead investor. The man beside me stood up. The entire hall turned toward him at once. No long introduction, no titles. Attention arrived on its own. He took the microphone, spoke briefly about the space, about the value of things made by hand in a world that loves speed. No one clapped midway. Everyone listened. Then he turned toward me. That look didn't ask permission. It simply confirmed. "And before we continue," he said, "I'd like to invite someone up here. Not because he's famous, but because without him this room wouldn't stand the way it does today." I felt Melissa's hand tighten around mine. I stood up on instinct. Not because I wanted the stage, but because I knew that if I stayed seated, the story would no longer be mine. I walked up, step by step. The lights came down on me. I wasn't used to this brightness. I looked out over the hall. I saw Brandon. His face had gone pale. He shook his head ever so slightly, a belated plea. The man stood beside me, placed a hand on my shoulder. Not heavy, not forcing. "This is Gregory," he said. "The man who built the table you're leaning on. The man who taught me that true value never needs to be displayed." No one laughed. No one whispered. This silence wasn't dismissal anymore. It was full attention. I took the microphone. My hands didn't shake. I had no prepared speech. I only spoke what I knew. I'm not used to standing here, I said. I'm used to standing behind the things people use every day. I paused, looked down. I saw Melissa. I saw her nod, just slightly. Tonight, I continued, I only wanted to sit with my wife, in a place where we didn't have to hide. I handed the microphone back. Nothing more. I didn't need to add anything. The room understood on its own. As I stepped down, the man leaned toward me again, his voice calm just as it had been from the start. Thank you, he said, for sitting with me. I looked at him. This time, I understood. I wasn't pretending to sit with him. For the first time that evening, I was sitting exactly where I belonged. I had just stepped off the stage when Brandon rushed toward us. He moved fast, but didn't dare run. I recognized that walk, the walk of someone trying to keep their dignity, when the cracks are already showing. What are you doing, Dad? He said, voice low but urgent. You weren't allowed up there. I looked at my son. I felt no anger. I only saw a young man standing between two worlds, and both were about to close their doors. The man beside me had heard enough. He turned to Brandon. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried far enough for those nearby to hear. You don't decide who's allowed to stand here, he said, especially when you're standing on things built by someone else. Brandon froze. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. Sloane stepped in, forcing a polite smile. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding, she said. Today is our wedding day. The man nodded slightly. Yes, and it's also a good day for the truth. He turned to the host and gave a short signal. No explanations, no requests. The microphone was handed back to him. The hall fell silent again. This time the silence carried expectation. I imagine, he said, many people here are wondering why I invited Gregory onto the stage. He paused, looked at me, then scanned the room. Many years ago I was looking for a small woodworking shop, not to buy profit, but to preserve a way of working that was slowly disappearing. That shop belonged to Gregory. I heard a few murmurs. Brandon snapped his head toward me. The anger was gone. What remained was fear. I bought the shop, the man continued, and paid a fair price. Gregory never knew who the buyer was. He thought it was simply support, a chance to rest. Then he looked straight at Brandon. That same money became your starting capital. Not luck, not exceptional talent, but the hands you tried to hide tonight. The air in the hall grew heavy. I saw Sloane tighten her grip on Brandon's hand. Her parents exchanged looks, then turned away, as if avoiding a direct light. Brandon took a step forward. This has nothing to do with today. The man tilted his head. It does, because you used a different story to sell your image. He gestured toward the screen behind the stage. A short video began to play. I didn't need to watch to know. Brandon talking about his background, about connections he had supposedly built himself. Smooth words. No me, no Melissa, no workshop, no scent of wood. I didn't come up here to embarrass anyone, the man said. I only want to return things to their source. Brandon stepped back, half a pace. He turned to me, panic in his eyes. Dad, he said. The first time he had called me that all evening. Dad, say something. I stepped forward. I didn't need the microphone. I didn't need the stage. I reached into my inner pocket and took out an old watch. Scratched face, worn strap. I'd kept it for years, planning to give it to my son when the time felt right. I placed the watch on the table in front of Brandon. I brought this, I said calmly. I thought today was the day. Brandon stared at it. I saw his hands tremble. But maybe I continued. You already have another world now. One that doesn't need your parents. No blame, no raised voice. Just the truth. Slow and clear. The way I measure wood before cutting. We don't belong here, I said. And I don't want you to feel ashamed of us ever again. I turned to the man beside me. He gave a slight nod. I'm withdrawing, he said, turning back to Brandon. All investments connected to your company. Effective after tonight. No one breathed loudly. No applause. No sense of victory. Just a door, closing slowly, without a sound. Brandon stood still. Sloane let go of his hand. Her parents had already turned away. I looked at my son one last time. I didn't see an enemy. I saw someone who had traded too early. I took Melissa's hand. Let's go home, I said. We walked out of the wedding hall without anyone stopping us. No suspicious looks. No whispers. Only the music behind us, fading with each step. Outside the sea, air felt cooler. Melissa let out a long breath, like she had just left a room without windows. I knew tonight hadn't ended everything, but one thing was clear. Once the truth is placed on the table, it doesn't need more words to stand on its own. 6 months have passed since that night. I didn't count the days, but I remember clearly the feeling when the hotel doors closed behind us. Not relief, just silence. A silence wide enough for Melissa and me to walk side by side again, without looking over our shoulders. In the days that followed, I didn't look for Brandon. I didn't avoid him either. I simply returned to my old rhythm, waking before the sun, making coffee for Melissa, sitting by the window listening to the sea breeze. Her leg slowly stopped hurting, not because of medicine, but because she no longer had to tense herself to stand in the right place. News reached us in very ordinary ways, not through the media, not from anyone who had been at the wedding. An old acquaintance called, asked if I was doing okay, then mentioned that Brandon's company was struggling, contracts frozen, partners pulling away. No one explained much. Everyone understood why. A few weeks later, Brandon called. The call lasted less than a minute. He apologized. No excuses, no blame. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When he fell silent, I told him I hoped he would be safe and steady. I didn't promise help. I didn't accuse him either. I only said, some lessons can't be borrowed from anyone else. Sloan left sooner than I expected. When the support disappeared, patience did too. I wasn't happy about it. I wasn't sad either. It only made one thing clearer. Relationships built on image collapse quickly once the lights go out. The man from the hotel, Nate, kept his word. He met with me a few times, not to talk about the past, but to ask what I wanted to do next. I told him I didn't want to return to my old shop. I wanted to keep my hands busy, just in a different way. What do you want to preserve? He asked. I want to preserve how people learn to work, I said, slowly, honestly, without shame. That's how the vocational workshop was born. Not big, no bright sign, just a clean workspace. Enough light, enough wood, enough safe tools. We take in kids who don't have anywhere to go after school. We don't promise bright futures. We only promise hands that know how to make something useful. Melissa goes there every day. She makes tea, applies bandages, listens. Some afternoons, she sits in the corner, watching the kids smile when a piece of wood fits right for the first time. In those moments, she looks younger, not because she forgot, but because she finally let go. One afternoon, while I was adjusting a shelf, I saw Brandon standing outside the fence. He didn't come in. He stood there for a long time. I didn't rush. I wiped my hands and walked over. I don't know if I should go in, he said. You're standing in the right place, I replied. If you want to learn, you can come in. If you just want to watch, standing there is fine too. He came in, didn't say much. He picked up a piece of wood, awkward and unsure. I didn't correct him right away. I let him measure, cut, notice the mistake himself. When the saw drifted, I only said, stop, look again. That was enough. We never talked about the hotel night. We didn't need to. What had to be said was already said. What needed fixing had to be done by hand. Time did what it always does, quietly, steadily. I watched Brandon learn to listen, not to me, but to the material in front of him. I saw him understand that some things can't be rushed, and some foundations can't be rebuilt with words. One day Nate stopped by. He stood outside, didn't make a sound, watched the kids work, watched Melissa smile. He didn't give a speech. He just placed an envelope on the table, said it was a scholarship fund for next year. I nodded. No long thanks needed. That evening, as I closed the workshop, I stood by the fence. I remembered the room behind the kitchen, the cold, white light, the screen mounted high. I remembered the feeling of being placed somewhere without windows. Then I looked back inside the shop, where light falls straight onto the workbench, where everyone stands equal before a piece of wood. That's when I understood the final truth of this story. It isn't about who lost what. It's about who managed to keep something. Wealth isn't a balance sheet. It's how you treat the people who laid your first bricks. And gratitude isn't something you say. It's something you do, again and again, even when no one is watching. If you ask me what I would do if I could go back to that night, My answer is simple. I would still hold my wife's hand, stand straight, and walk toward the light. Not to prove anything, but to remind myself, there are places you don't need permission to belong. If this story made you pause, even for a moment, please, subscribe, and share, so more people can hear stories like this. Your support helps real human stories continue to be told. The lesson I learned is simple. Never trade your roots for a temporary seat, and never look down on the hands that built the foundation of your life. Reputation can fade. Money can change owners, but how you treat your parents will stay with you for the rest of your life. Thank you for staying until the end, and for listening to my story.